Can familial hypercholesterolemia be managed without statins? Hi, I'm Chris Masterjohn, and I have a PhD in nutritional sciences. I am not a medical doctor, and nothing contained in this episode may be construed as medical or nutritional advice of any kind, or a substitute therefore. This episode is meant purely as scientific education. If you wish to act on any ideas presented in this episode, please consult your physician first, and never take anything herein as a reason to contradict medical advice. With that said, enjoy the episode.
So thanks for having me, and thanks for all the time you spent with us and
You're welcome.
And questions.
Thanks for coming on.
So I got a new client who got a heart attack 5 years ago and got diagnosed with FH and has been put on statins ever since. And now she developed like type 2 diabetic on top. The doctor insists that the dosage of statins should be so high to keep her LDL-C below 15 milligrams per deciliter. So my questions would be first...
15? 1-5?
50.
Okay.
Would you agree with that it's really necessary? Second question would be, is there like a kind of functional medicine way to deal with FH without going the way of statins, and see how or what would be your best strategy to lower insulin without raising the LDL-C?
Yeah. Okay. So, first of all, I mean, I know you know this, but just to sort of like preface this with a disclaimer, I'm not a doctor and not a cardiologist by any means. And so anything I say in this case is just my opinion and should be taken as such. So I think that, and I wouldn't change anyone's medication on my advice ever, but my personal opinion is that I think what they're doing is they see this as using the precautionary principle. And so I think there's the general perspective that there's no point in having LDL-C be any higher than 50. Therefore, since it doesn't matter, let's provide a sufficient margin of error where, we're real confident that getting it down to 100 is great. And so why not get it down to 50? If there is any extra protection, we get it and we don't lose it. I'm sort of like, I don't believe in the lower is better and there's no point in having cholesterol higher than X attitude. I totally agree with, I'm sure they would critique my point of view as follows. Like, I would point out that there is evidence that having your cholesterol, your total cholesterol below 160-ish or so is bad for neurological health. And I believe they would counter that the evidence isn't that great. And I agree with that, but that's because there's been, obscene amounts of money poured into researching how you can get CVD down by lowering cholesterol. And there's been almost no money poured into researching the neurological consequences of having cholesterol below a certain point. And so I don't think it makes any sense whatsoever to base the totality of your view based on what has been researched, when the reasons for having more confidence in one point versus another is based purely on one being under researched. So my point of view would be, I would personally rather use a more conservative target of lowering down to like 100 or so, where the confidence is actually really high, because I'm not convinced by the lack of confidence that there's no neurological downside to pushing it twice as low as that. So that's my general perspective. And if this were me, and it'll never be, because I can't for the life of me get my total cholesterol above 160, but if it were me, I'd be lowering my dose on that out of precaution on the other side. Now, the other part of your question is like, what else could you do? And I would note that, I imagine a lot of people listening already know this, but CoQ10 and MK4 would be two critical things to supplement with on the statins. So I do have a podcast on what to do about heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. And so if you Google my name, Masterjohn heterozygous FH or something like that, you should get that podcast up. There's a short one I did on Chris Masterjohn Light, but there's also a longer one that's like an hour long. I should bring in the chat here. So there's someone was saying FH is well addressed with PCSK9 inhibitors, even in the absence of statins. Yeah, that's true. PCSK9 inhibitors, though, apart from costing like $140,000 a year in, total healthcare burden to insurance and whoever's paying for it, PCSK9 inhibitors are not without their side effects. I've had clients come to me who had like extreme exercise intolerance that were directly precipitated by going on PCSK9 inhibitors, and no one could do anything for it. So I'm not, whatever you think might be potential side effect of statins, I don't at all think PCSK9 inhibitors, which do literally the same thing. Well, actually, that's not true. Not literally the same thing. They do literally the same thing in terms of how they lower cholesterol by increasing the LDL receptor. But they're, so like consequences of mevalonate inhibition, like decreased synthesis of CoQ10 and MK4 are going to be different, but consequences of lowering LDL cholesterol are going to be the same. But anyway, so dietarily, I think that the best thing that you can do is, first of all, do a dietary experiment to see what are the most sensitive things that control cholesterol levels in that person. And most likely those are going to be either saturated fat or dietary cholesterol. But although you could screen for other problems, so, inflammation is a factor, thyroid health is a factor, and so on. But, assuming all those other ducks are in order, like this person's eating decently and has a good microbiome, their thyroid's, they have a healthy thyroid level, and they don't have a systemic inflammation problem driven by something besides this issue, then assuming that, you're probably going to find that they are very responsive to dietary cholesterol, whereas you might expect that most people wouldn't be. But I think people with FH are generally going to be much more sensitive to dietary cholesterol, and they are probably very responsive to saturated fat, particularly if they are sensitive to increasing their cholesterol output in response to saturated fat, then their blood levels will probably be responsive, because remember, in someone with FH, the problem is they're not clearing it from the blood. So anything that gets cholesterol into the blood in the first place is going to not be cleared as effectively. And so, dietary cholesterol might have the feedback loop of suppressing cholesterol synthesis, but it's still making it into the blood. And if you can't clear it from the blood, it's going to be a factor. Saturated fat, whether it boosts cholesterol, is going to depend on, other genes involved in cholesterol synthesis. But if it does, they're going to have trouble clearing that. So although I'm not a big fan of restricting saturated fat and cholesterol from a nutrition perspective, I think if your goal is to treat FH without statins or PCSK9 inhibitors, then you're going to have, most likely you're going to have to go on a low fat, that's the other thing. In general, so the molecular biology behind this is kind of complicated, but carbohydrate and insulin act as PCSK9 inhibitors in people who are insulin sensitive, and act as PCSK9 stimulators in people who are insulin resistant. And that relates to the fact that in people with insulin resistance, they generally have selective hepatic insulin resistance, which makes the lipid synthesis pathway in the liver not resistant, and the carbohydrate metabolizing pathway in the liver resistant. So the person winds up with hyperlipidemia that gets worse with carbohydrate because the lipid synthesis pathway is not resistant, and hyperglycemia in response to carbohydrate because the carbohydrate metabolizing pathway is resistant. If you look at those pathways, that basically works out so that the mix of those responses to insulin lead to PCSK9 inhibition when things are working properly, and lead to PCSK9 stimulation when things are messed up in that way. And so I think for someone who's overweight and insulin resistant, carbohydrate's not going to be a helpful thing. But if they get those other things in line, and so they're lean, healthy body composition, insulin sensitive, generally more carbohydrate is going to lead to PCSK9 inhibition. And on top of that, more carbohydrate is going to lead to increased thyroid activity within the normal range. And so by shifting the diet away from fat and toward carbohydrate, you are going to get more thyroid activity, less PCSK9 activity. And so a low fat, low saturated fat, low cholesterol diet that is rich in healthy, unrefined, whole food starches is probably going to be the diet that's going to help manage that most without a statin. And when I'm looking at that, that has obvious implications of you're probably going to have to mostly clear out eggs. You're probably going to have to mostly clear out dairy fat. And so, other people might not think that's an issue at all. Whereas, in our circle, we understand that has nutritional implications. So there's a lot of things that you're going to have to compensate for, like biotin and choline, and so on and so forth, because of the things that you'd have to clear out of the diet in that way. But if you can achieve natural LDL receptor upregulation and PCSK9 inhibition with diet and lifestyle, why not do that first, is how I would see that.
So actually, she's pretty lean for her age, and but the diet is very crappy. So lots of processed sugars, lots of
which means
coffee, very little protein. So my point was, how do you raise really protein intake without taking her all the only vegan part and probably getting her to consume too much carbohydrates?
So I think you get protein up with lean proteins. And so, that means like white fish, poultry, and low fat milk instead of whole eggs and full fat milk and beef. So that's, and again, that's not my standard dietary approach, but it has its tool in the tool belt, and this is a case where that is relevant. And then carbohydrates, I think you want to cut out the junk.
Yeah,
but if you have someone who's got stable blood sugar and is metabolically healthy, at that point, it becomes an advantage to increase the whole food starches in that person. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Christian.
This episode was part of a Q&A for members of the CMJ Masterpass, a buyer's club with exclusive and massive discounts on your favorite premium foods and health products, including pasture-raised and wild meat and seafood, supplements, sleep accessories, water filters, phototherapy devices, and much more. As a bonus, you also get to participate in monthly private Zoom Q&As with me. You can join the Masterpass at chrismasterjohnphd.com/masterpass and use the code Q&A, spelled out as Q-A-N-D-A, Q&A, for a 10% lifetime discount. From now through February or March, whatever it takes to get it done, I will be working full-time on finishing my Vitamins and Minerals 101 book, while reserving a portion of my time for my consulting clients. You can pre-order my book at chrismasterjohnphd.com/book. In my consulting, I am neither a medical practitioner nor a coach. I serve as your data analyst and your strategist. I teach you scientific principles of health and wellness, help you analyze your data, and help brainstorm actionable strategies. You can sign up for a consultation at chrismasterjohnphd.com/consultations. I will try to respond to comments here when I can, but my presence will be intermittent while I'm finishing my book. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next episode.